If you Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the City of Waterloo Council meeting, Monday, October 3rd, 2022 at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. Our penultimate council meeting. That's a good word, eh? Penultimate. We begin our meetings, as always, with a territorial acknowledgement. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather and are broadcasting from today is a land traditionally cared for by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and neutral people. We also acknowledge the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge and philosophies of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land today. A moment of reflection. At the beginning of this council meeting, we pause to think about the needs of our community. May we show wisdom and compassion in all our decisions. And I have a council statement here on Islamic Heritage Month. October is Islamic Heritage Month, providing an opportunity to celebrate and recognize the contributions of Muslims in our community and across Canada. This is also an opportunity to gain understanding of the history and diversities of Islam, to disrupt stereotypes and beliefs that are barriers to inclusion, and reaffirm our commitment to confronting hate and Islamophobia in all forms. This year's theme highlights the multicultural flavors of Muslim cuisine. A multitude of people, stories, and cultures exist within the Islamic faith, and Muslim cuisine is a direct reflection of that. Our city is enriched by the presence and contributions made by the Muslim community who bring culture, traditions, and flavors from around the world to Waterloo. These culinary contributions enhance the social and cultural fabric of our city. I encourage you to support local businesses operated by our friends and neighbors and borrow resources from the Waterloo Public Library to explore Islamic heritage further. Could I have disclosure of pecuniary interest and the general nature thereof from any council member? Seeing Councillor Freeman, please go ahead.
Through Mayor Jaworski, it's actually on tonight's agenda. Shall I just wait till 6:30? Okay, it's with regard to the informal meeting for official plan amendment 41 and zoning bylaw amendment Z2212 for Van Legend Regina L Limited Partnership and 6 Regina Street North and 24, 28, 34 Herb Street East with regard to my place of employment.
Excellent. So noted, and we will repeat that again at night. Any further? Seeing none, we'll move on to the approval of minutes. You'll see minutes there from the September 12th, 2022 council meeting. Any commentary on that? Seeing none, moved by Councillor Veith, seconded by Councillor Bodley. All those in favor? That carries unanimously. Thank you. Under delegation, Sustainable Waterloo Region will appear tonight at 6:30. Moving on to item 6, consent agenda. You'll see that there's items A through D. I will note that we received correspondence from KLG, who is going to delegate tonight, but has instead provided us with some commentary via email. And so with that, everything stays on the consent agenda. Does anybody have any commentary or wish to pull anything from the consent agenda? Councillor Bonagor, please go ahead.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, I'm hoping to pull item D just for a question for staff.
Excellent. But while I have you on the line, we'd consider moving A through C.
Indeed, I move.
Moved by Councillor Bonagor, seconded by Councillor Henry. All those in favor of those, A through C. Councillor Freeman, I didn't see your hand. Okay, approved unanimously. Moving on to items removed from consent agenda, which is item D, 515 Herbsville Road demolition. Please go ahead, Councillor Bonagor.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Jaworski. I just have a question for staff related to this matter. When people see applications for early demolition, they often have concern about losing housing stock during a housing crisis. And, you know, as you said, Mayor, KLG did email us about this as well, and that was part of her submission to council. So we have received some very thoughtful questions about this matter. And I was just hoping to ask for a response or just some information from staff, if possible, to talk about whether the affordable housing strategy includes consideration of potential tools or processes to retain affordable housing stock while building proposals are being created and assessed.
I'll look to Mr. Cotter to provide a response.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Bonagor. It's a good question. Yes, the affordable housing strategy is looking at the issue of demolition with respect to maintaining the supply of housing stock as long as practical. Certainly, we turn away more demolition requests or early demolition requests than we actually bring forward to council. On occasion, we do bring forward some to typically advanced development, or we believe that there could be ongoing concerns. And I think the reports that are in front of council, we've identified in each of the circumstances, situations where we want to address a consideration that may be just outside the norm. So we are looking at it, and we will be including recommendations and commentary in the affordable housing strategy for council's consideration.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
It's Councillor Henry, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. And just following up, Mr. Cotter, on that, I know since we last sort of saw a draft of the affordable housing strategy, the region approved the first sort of phase of their ROP update, and there was some policy language in the housing section around demolition and maintaining a level of affordability for subsequent developments on the same site. And I know that's not listed in our affordable housing strategy, but I was just curious if staff are going to take a look at some of the new policy direction we're going to have to sort of incorporate in the OP review as part of bringing the affordable housing strategy back that we may not have considered at the beginning.
Yeah, through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Henry. Yes, we are aware of the ROP policies in that direction. We are reviewing that matter. Typically, most of the demolition submissions we bring to council relate to provisions under the Planning Act, but there are also some tools under the Municipal Act that may aid in that policy discussion. So we're actively reviewing those, and they will also be part of the affordable housing strategy as it's brought forward to council in the near future.
Seeing no further questions, this address seems somewhat Ward 2-ish, so I'll go to the Ward 2 councillor.
Sorry, I was going to ask just a quick question.
Go ahead.
That's okay. Through you, Mayor Jaworski, if I could just get some sort of clarification that I know that there's a forthcoming sort of subdivision, plan of subdivision coming forward for this area of the community, and just some confirmation that by us approving the demolition of this house, that it is not going to be fettering our position in any way on the potential subdivision approval, particularly as we look at some of the environmental concerns and wildlife corridors and things like that that are very pertinent in this area of the city, noting that 515 Erbsville technically goes all the way back into the ESPA. If I could just get confirmation on that, that would be appreciated.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Bodley, I can confirm that this will not fetter council's decision relating to the future plan of subdivision and zoning application, and you are correct that the westerly part of the property is anticipated as open space, part of ESPA, Forested Hills 19, and it would be the intention of the city to maintain that in a natural state. So a portion of the easterly property is designated for low-density residential, and that will be the area within which we would consider development applications. Those will come forward in the near future. The applicant is beginning that process now and working their way towards developing ultimately this link between Columbia Forest 1 and Columbia Forest 2, which is important for trails and other connections.
Excellent. Thank you. Happy to move the
One more question. Councillor
sorry.
Henry, please go ahead. I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Mayor, through you. And it's not actually a question. My apologies to council. I missed a declaration of conflict on this particular item. Family member who is a partner with the group that is representing the applicant. So my apologies.
Okay, so it's on this one, item D. Okay, so with that, we'll ask you to run away quickly, but don't go too far. By the time you leave, we'll be back. You just... All right, so while she's away, no, okay. Okay, moved by Councillor Bodley, seconded by Councillor Vasek. All those in favor? That carries. Okay, we'll just pause while the councillor walks back. Moving on to item 8. First up is item 8A, Development Charge Background Study, Council Update. A report prepared for us by Michael Puglisi, and presentation today by Stefan Krechunovich.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you, members of council. My purpose today is to update you on the development charge bylaw process, which is well underway. And you'll have 2 resolutions before you in the staff report. One that asks you to direct us to prepare a development charges background study on the basis of a list of capital works that are attached to the staff report. And the second resolution asks you to express your intent to continue the city's long-standing practice of imposing development charges on a uniform citywide basis. And I'll speak a little bit about that as we move forward. I know this council has been through a development charge process already, but just so that we're on the same page, these are fees that are imposed on developers to pay for growth-related capital costs. So the operative words here are capital costs only, not operating costs, and only to the extent that capital is related to expanding or adding to or otherwise implementing new facilities and infrastructure to benefit new development. The principle behind the charges is that growth should pay for itself, so that the burden of expanding infrastructure is not borne by your existing ratepayers. From the developer's perspective, when they come to the counter to pay the charge, they actually pay 3 charges at the city desk. One is to the region, one is to the city, and one is for education purposes. So to be clear, we are only talking about the city's development charge when we talk about this process. Development charges are imposed by bylaw, and your bylaw expires in December 2024. It's been advanced in time for several reasons. First of all, there's been quite a lot of changes to the development charge legislation in the last few years. As you know, you passed a CBC bylaw last week, so the idea was to try and harmonize the development charges with the new community benefits charges. And of course, we've had this little disruption of COVID in the last few years, so I think the feeling is that it's worth reviewing some of the main assumptions that go into the background study, including long-term forecasts and capital plans in light of the changes that have occurred. Before you pass a bylaw, you have to undertake a background study, and that's what we've been retained to help you with. You have to hold at least one public meeting, and for a 40-day period after the bylaw is passed, anyone can appeal the rates and the provisions of the bylaw to the Ontario Land Tribunal. I just want to highlight one of the changes that's occurred to the legislation is that it now includes a list of services for which municipalities can impose development charges. This wasn't here before. The services that are in red on the screen are the services which we're currently considering imposing a charge for. All of those services you already have a charge in place for, so there's been no change there. The only change of note is that if you look at the bottom right there are 2 services for which you have a charge which are now sort of ineligible for this kind of funding, and that's the parking and the cemeteries. As I mentioned earlier, one of the resolutions that's before you is to express your intent to proceed with imposing charges on a uniform citywide basis. So that under that system, no matter where you develop in the city, you pay the same charge. Everyone pays the same. We are required through the process to consider the use of area-specific charges. So that kind of framework would reflect the fact that some areas may be more expensive to service than others, and higher charges would apply if you were to impose that kind of system. In Ontario, the area-specific charges are used almost exclusively where you're opening up a new area of greenfield land and you need to extend water and sewer pipes or stormwater services, and you can clearly on the line of the map delineate the benefiting area of that new infrastructure. It's hardly ever used for the vast majority of services that are in your bylaw, because the projects that you're funding have a broad basis, broad benefit. All of the residents in the city can use the services and the works, and you have very little greenfield land left on which to develop. So a lot of the projects that you see in the project list are there to facilitate intensification, and intensification in the city of Waterloo is done at a very broad scale. I guess the other thing to point out is that for the entire period of time you've had DCs, you have imposed this uniform citywide approach, and so the recommendation is to maintain that moving forward. The background study itself will include a forecast of future development. I'll speak a little bit about this in the next slide. It'll include a lot of detail about the capital infrastructure you already own and the levels of service that you have provided in the past. Those levels of service set a limit on how much you can fund in the future. The background study will also include a detailed list of capital works, and as I say, that list has been included as part of the staff report. We can only fund costs that are not otherwise paid for by external grants and subsidies, costs that represent a benefit to your existing residents, costs for which you have development charge reserve funds on hand to pay for, and costs for some pieces of infrastructure that are going to benefit development beyond the time horizon covered by the background study. So once all of those things have been removed, we're left with a pool of costs that are eligible for DC funding, and we calculate a rate that is imposed on residential development as a charge per unit and as a charge per gross floor area of new building space on non-residential development. The current charges in the city are shown on the left here. So these are the residential charges, and they range from about $16,500 for a single detached unit down to $4,700 for a lodging house. And there's various charges in the middle for sort of medium density and then higher density rates, where there's small apartments, which are $9,000, and the larger apartments, which are $20,000, just over $20,000 a unit. And you can see on the right, the pie chart, that about just under 50% of the charge is for, the so-called engineering services, so water, sewer, storm, roads. And then of the non-engineered services, the vast majority of the charge is for parks and indoor recreation facilities. And on the non-residential side, it's just under $72 a square meter of new floor space. And again, the vast majority of the non-residential charge is for the engineered services. On the development forecast, there's been a few changes that we're working through. We're required to do a forecast of the amount, type, and location of development, and with the resolution, should you pass it today, that will help us move forward with looking at things on a citywide basis. We're going to be calculating the charges over a 10-year period for the general services, and we're going to be going to 2041 for the engineered services. Those timeframes are consistent with the master plans that have been used to establish the need for future works, and they are also consistent with your capital budget and forecast documents. And they also happen to be the same planning periods that we used for the last study in 2019. And the forecasts will be anchored on the population and employment targets that were recently established through the regional official planning exercise. And we're working, in fact, we have a meeting with planning staff tomorrow to review these. And they, as I say, details of all of the forecasts will be included in the background study. And then just to finish up, this just summarizes for each service the costs of the works that we are looking at. So for each of the services here, you'll see a list of works in your staff report. For the general services, it's about $67 million worth of capital works. And moving to the right-hand column at the bottom, you can see that about 52 million is being brought forward to the development charge calculation. Most of that would be parks and recreation facilities. And on the engineering side of the ledger, we're looking at about $426 million of capital works. And on the right-hand column there, you can see that only 163 million of that total would be brought forward to the development charge calculation, because there are significant components of those works that will be benefiting the people who already live in the city. As I mentioned earlier, we can't fund that kind of thing through the development charge. This is our schedule then. We've been meeting regularly with a group of development industry stakeholders, going through the projects, and we will be reviewing the development forecast with them. The idea is to release the background study in draft form in December, hold the statutory public meeting in January, be able to bring a bylaw to you with rates for your consideration in early February, and have the new rates effective for March the 1st. So I'm happy to answer any questions, Mr. Mayor, that you or council may have. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Stefan. First off out of the gate is Councillor Freeman.
Through Mayor Jaworski, can I trouble you just to go back to the slide where you list all the services that can be covered by DCs? I think it was like the second or third slide. This one, yeah. So one of the things I noticed on here was emergency preparedness, and I just wasn't sure what that covered. And I guess I'm asking the question recognizing that with climate change, we're having challenges around climate-based emergencies to city services, and I just didn't know if it fell under that or if that was specifically referring to something different.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it's a fairly broad definition. A number of municipalities have separate departments or sub-departments to deal with significant climatic events like flooding or major storms, or also, making preparations for long-term adaptation to climate change. And so the activities of those departments or sub-departments are often included as a separate development charge. My sense is that a lot of that work is being picked up through the capital works that have been identified as part of the Fire Protection Services charge, but I defer to staff perhaps to give you a bit more detail on that.
Thanks. Through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Freeman. So we don't specifically have any, as Stefan noted, departments related to emergency preparedness. It is, however, in certain areas within stormwater, for example, flooding. But to note, this is just for capital expenditures. So outside of possible studies, this wouldn't cover, DCs wouldn't cover any operational costs of storm damage, recuperation, things like that, or any of the operating costs. So it's not something we've budgeted at the citywide level through our annual budgeting process. But I think that's just why it's I guess gotten a bit more attention. Stefan, if you correct me if I'm wrong, that it's now got its own section in the bylaw where this, or the act where this wasn't there previously. But anything that we have for capital works associated with stormwater, flooding mitigation, like all those capital costs would be within a stormwater area, certain project sheets, or if there's any fire preparedness or studies or whatnot, they would be in those services.
I guess that I'm just thinking that there are things that I think we've funded through the capital program, such as emergency operation centers, backup diesel gensets, changes to fleet vehicles to account for different types, for example, of road control. So where we might have used salt before, we're using brine. And also when we look at resiliency, so we might be putting a new subdivision upstream of something, and we have to think differently about the downstream infrastructure because of resiliency issues. I appreciate what you're saying about some of it being covered likely in a stormwater budget, but I'm asking the question here. Recognize, for example, I think a great example was we built all the development upstream of Clare Lake, and because of the upstream development, we've filled the lake with sediment, and then with climate change, it resulted in flooding downstream of the man-made dam. Maybe that could have been considered under emergency preparedness had this been in the act some years ago. And so I guess I'm just trying to encourage us to think about it. Is this something that we should be tapping into? Have we covered it through all of our budgets? I don't know. We've got a sustainability department, which is kind of trying to look at that whole city lens around mitigation and resiliency. So I'm just going to throw that out to you. If we haven't looked at it, maybe this is an opportunity to think a little bit more on that before now in January.
Thank you. Next up, I have Councillor Vasic, then Councillor Henry.
Thanks, through you, Mayor Jaworski. Thanks for the presentation. I don't know if, because I've been doing it for 4 years, that I actually understood what you were saying a lot more than the first time you came to council. That presentation was a really good primer. Yeah. Maybe it's the exact same one, and I just know a little bit more now. My question is around affordable housing and some who claim that having DCs worsens the affordable housing crisis. Could you speak to that? Is there any truth to that, or no?
Well, through you, Mr. Mayor, that's not an easy question to answer. And the only honest answer is it depends. Historically, and on the academic side of things, there's been quite a lot of study on the effect of development charges on rates of development. And there's hardly any, well, I can't think of a study that's been done that I've reviewed, and I do follow this stuff, that's shown that there is any direct relationship between the amount of a development charge and the rate of residential development. It's slightly different on the non-residential side in some cases, but on the residential side, the fastest growing places in Ontario tend to have the highest development charges. That being said, I think we should also remember too that development charge is just one of a number of different charges that come into play when you're developing a piece of land, and decisions about, whether to build, how much to build, where to build, involve a lot more than just the fees and charges that are going to be paid at some point in the building process. So there's that aspect as well. And I think the final thing to understand too is that these charges are there to pay for infrastructure without which you would not be able to develop in the first place. So yes, my view would be that this is part of doing business in any one place, but its purpose is to pay for things that allow development to proceed. And as I say, there's very little evidence to show that it has any bearing on the rate of residential growth at a citywide basis, for sure.
Great, thank you. That's wildly helpful. So then a follow-up question to that. That's great that you're on top of the academic work too. Do you know of any municipalities where they've waived development charges and they seem to not be going through the same affordable housing crisis everyone else is?
So there's lots, through you, Mr. Mayor, there's lots of examples of municipalities using their development charge bylaw to incentivize very specific types of development. Affordable housing, in a very generic way, is quite tricky to deal with because it covers a lot of different types of development, and sometimes it's very difficult to define exactly what you're trying to incent when you try and use the DC bylaw to do it. So the tendency in recent years has been to try and use other tools to provide financial incentives for affordable housing rather than the development charge bylaw. The other thing about the development charge bylaw is that once you provide an incentive or an exemption, provided you still proceed with the works, you have to find some other source of revenue to pay for it, because you can't pass the savings on, as a higher DC on another form of development. So invariably, you have to fund it through the property tax or the water and sewer rates or the stormwater fees. So that calculus has to come into play when you're looking at this. And my view is the most successful incentives are ones that are very focused, either on a geographic area or on a very specific type of development, rather than a fairly generic thing.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Excellent information. Over to you, Councillor Henry.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for sort of running through those details. That's an interesting conversation. I wanted to talk about a specific kind of incentive that we've had baked into our DC bylaw and the region's DC bylaw for some time around industrial land. That is sort of core in there. And I'm curious generally if that scenario we want to continue to incentivize given through this process, given the historic shortages of land and the run-up of prices and sort of the demand-supply equation on industrial land seems to look a lot different than it did when I started around this table, and nobody was building it, and oh my God, it's very expensive, nobody's coming, we need to throw some money at it, in effect. So I'm curious what your sort of take is on the state of sort of industrial land development and DC exemptions and or reductions in charges.
Well, through you, Mr. Mayor, again, that's a subject we could speak at length about, as you know. And as you know, the price of industrial land has shot up in the last few years, and the demand for that type of land is off the charts. Historically, most incentives and development charges bylaws were there to create jobs in communities. Good, well-paying jobs, and that inevitably meant trying to attract the kinds of activities that occurred on employment lands, industrial activities. And to go back to the academics side of things, there was some indication that in certain circumstances they worked, because industrial developers have a lot of upfront costs to deal with, especially if it's a lot of furniture and equipment to put into place. And so it mattered when they were making locational decisions as to how much they were going to have to pay in fees and charges and so on and so forth. I suspect that that's less of an issue today than it was, over the last 20 years. And as you've pointed out, that's been seen with the premiums that we're seeing on a lot of industrial land. So, in the region of Waterloo context and the city's context, where you are a very attractive place for a whole range of different employment activities, I think you're going to be hearing about that in your next slideshow. It's worth considering whether the value of this kind of incentive and whether it's really making the sort of impact that it would have when it was originally conceived. I think that's worth considering moving forward.
Okay, thank you. I'll just wait, and I do have a few questions. Regarding area rating, are we deciding that today? And the reason I ask is because I'll ask Ron to listen in, but if I think about the Herbsville Road development that's coming up, there's a lot of key infrastructure, or not Herbsville Road, the Herbsville area developments going on. There's a lot of key infrastructure that's going in for that area, pumping stations and the like, that would, they're, to my knowledge, solely for the new residents. And I'm just wondering if that is something we would consider, and is that being eliminated as an option today or not?
Well, Mr. Mayor, I would never say you're eliminating it as an option, because you can always revisit things, as I say, when we bring the bylaw forward. The idea right now is that you express your intent to pursue a citywide charge. So to that extent, we would be working from now on the basis that we would not be having an area-specific charge for the works that you've just raised. I guess the other thing to point out is that even if there are one or two projects where there is a very clear benefit to a specific development or a development area, your practice over the last 20 years has been, for all the greenfield development that's taken place, to adopt a uniform approach. So if the last remaining greenfield area of the city suddenly has a new, different policy framework sort of applied to it, I would say you're going to hear from those people. And
I won't. I can tell you that. I won't be
that's
here.
right. And I don't say that. I don't say that should in any way influence your policy decisions. But it's something we will have to wrestle with in a little more detail. And
No, that sounds like good information. It would be an unusual change in direction. So that's good. And then I would also, if you put up the slide that has the current DCs on there, including the 1-bedroom, 2, 3-bedroom, and beyond rate.
sorry.
That was something that last time council made a decision, we decided to equalize the 1, 2, 3 bedrooms so that the 2 and 3 bedrooms weren't disincented, so to speak. I would say during this term of council, I'll ask management to listen in. But I think during this term of council, we've had a lot of questions about 3-bedroom units. So I'm thinking that perhaps next term of council, they may wish to see something specific to 3-bedroom units, perhaps being a lower rate. I don't know if that's plausible or whatever, but I would just know that that's a common item that's being discussed at councils locally. The lack of 3-bedroom units, but it's more of a comment, take it for what it's worth, but I would think that next term of council there might be questions specific to 3-bedroom units. And that's all I had. I'll just look around the table one more time. Any last call, Councillor Henry?
I think just on that, my guess is, and staff will have to run that, is that the numbers won't show if you just plug the formula in a lower rate, so that would end up being an incentived rate that you'd have to pay for in other ways. So it doesn't mean that's not something that could be on the table, but my guess is that's how the maths would work out. That it wouldn't be lower than the 1 and 2s, it would probably end up being higher. And so that would be an incentive. The other piece on the area rating, because I know Councillor Durrell and I, at the time, had raised that issue as we had DC bylaw, I think 2014. And that was the last time staff did the math. And the difference was not particularly material on a per unit basis, and the administrative charge likely overran the benefit there. And I can't imagine, since the projects have shrunk, that the difference would have widened materially to sort of warrant the burden and the scrutiny. But that's just sauce on the goose of sort of last time we talked about it, which was, I think, before you were around the table. We didn't do it because it wasn't material in terms of the change and worth the administrative overhead. I don't know if the cost would have changed on that.
Well, several of us are obviously going to have to come back and sit in the other seats and just bring back this historical knowledge as years go by. So we're continue to be informed. I don't see any further questions, but I had look for a mover and a seconder on this one. Moved by Councillor Henry, second by Councillor Hanmer. All those in favor? That's carried unanimously. Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael, too. Moving on to the official plan review, commercial and employment policy study prepared by Rick Martins. We do have a presentation by, I'm guessing you're Marian Mendoza. Welcome, Marian.
Good afternoon, Mayor Jaworski, members of council. I'll pass off to Marian in a moment. As you know, staff are undertaking an official plan review currently. A key component of that review was undertaking a detailed review of the city's employment and commercial framework. This part of the OP has not been updated since before or as part of the 2012 official plan process. So it was well timed to update the policies and the framework and to look at where we can go forward for the new official plan. So to that, we retained Urban Metrics to undertake this study, to do a market study, to review our policies, best practices, etc., to help inform the policy approach going forward for the official plan. So we have today Mary Mendoza from Urban Metrics representing the consultant study team to provide a bit more detail on the commercial employment review study, some of the details and strategic directions that we hope to incorporate and review in further detail as we move to the next phase of the official plan review. So with that, I'll turn it over to Marian.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Mayor Jaworski, councilors. My name is Marian Mendoza. I'm actually here on behalf of Rowan Faludi, who's a partner at Urban Metrics, but unfortunately he's out of the country, so I'm presenting on his behalf. We completed this study in collaboration with Gladkey Planning Associates. This slide just introduces the scope of our work, which spans 6 phases, and it's based on hundreds of similar studies that we've conducted in Ontario. An important part of the study was the consultation portion, where we distributed a community consumer survey. We received 780 respondents. We also distributed a business online survey and received 50 respondents. We conducted 9 stakeholder and business interviews, and we conducted 1 virtual workshop. Our review revealed some trends and key findings in the commercial and employment space. As you know, COVID-19 has had a profound impact in both of those, and firstly, it's the widespread adoption of e-commerce. Our research showed that there's an increased need for strategic industrial spaces near highway interchanges and large urban areas, and as mentioned in the previous presentation. And in terms of the brick and mortar space, there are strong consumer visitation in supermarket anchored and regional commercial nodes. Another important impact of COVID was the increased remote work, so work from home trends. But our studies also showed that workplaces in mixed use areas, particularly those near transit, amenities, food stores, these remain attractive choices. Our research shows that even before the pandemic, vacancy rates in uptown were around 7%, whereas in suburban markets, it was hovering around 13 to 20%. And so this bodes well as we're planning for our office to locate near the transit line and attractive areas. In terms of future need, as you know, the population of Waterloo is forecast to grow by about 58,000 residents. And our analysis reveals that there will be an additional 2.3 million square feet of space that will be warranted. There's about a shortfall of 1.9 million square feet, which we believe will be accommodated largely through mixed-use intensification modes. And also, as mentioned, the supply of industrial land is shrinking, but there's high demand for these lands. I talked with Councillor earlier about the supply of vacant employment lands in the city. We've identified about 200 hectares, but over half of those are owned by the University of Waterloo. That leaves less than half of them to be truly developable vacant employment lands. Our strategic directions, firstly with commercial, are to support intensification and transition of low-density retail plazas, such as Westmount Place. And as these projects are being redeveloped, to ensure that there's an associated growth of retail to support local serving uses. In employment, as I mentioned, a lot of the industrial buildings are exceeding the supply, and a lot of intensification will be needed to accommodate the forecasted employment growth in the city. This is where the West Side lands will be really critical in supporting employment land employment. These lands should be prioritized for light manufacturing, for processing and assembly, as these are the only significant source of vacant employment lands in the city. Other parcels are not as well suited as they're smaller. As well, with the West Side lands, these are located away from the LRT line, and so there's a lesser appetite for office uses on these lands. As such, we believe employment should be the priority for these lands. Our specific policy recommendations with mixed use are, first, to plan them on a district level rather than a site-by-site basis, and this could be secured at the block planning or secondary planning process. Secondly, we recommend establishing more flexibility in the types of uses that could be located at grade. These can go beyond retail. They can be institutional uses, they can be daycares, social community services. And moving forward, these spaces should be more flexible to be redemised or reconfigured as market needs shift. With the intensification of existing commercial nodes, this is a great opportunity to right-size that retail component. So whether or not that redevelopment occurs an increase or decrease of retail square footage, the planned function should be maintained and ensure that there will be adequate supply of food stores to support these growth. All these mixed-use projects should have a mix of unit sizes and uses to accommodate different occupants. Our general recommendations are to provide greater flexibility by reducing or even eliminating specific area and retail use type requirements. Another one is to simplify land use commercial designations between, for example, convenience commercial or neighborhood commercial to allow for more flexibility of what could locate there. And improve the access to retail service to really strengthen the city's policies behind active transportation. Ensure that there's access both on-street and on-site through active modes. Our employment recommendations, first, to designate academic lands as institutional. This is really to clarify the supply of developable vacant employment lands. We recommend prioritizing general employment uses on employment lands, particularly on the West Side lands, and concurrently to restrict office uses in these general employment designations. This is to allow more opportunities for existing industrial uses in the city to expand operations or even new operations that want to locate in the city. And also to maximize that impact of transit, to consolidate office near transit. Lands near Northfield, R&T, and Conestoga stations are great opportunities. And as it is in the existing framework, prioritize office and employment uses on these lands. In conclusion, the City of Waterloo will continue to grow, experience demand in employment space and in the retail service space. Although our findings identified a shortfall of land supply, we believe that with modifications to planning policy and with mixed-use intensification modes, the city will be able to accommodate the forecasted growth. And this is where it's really critical to develop that robust policy framework to maximize opportunities in office, commercial, and employment. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'll just look around to council to see who might have questions. Councillor Hanmer, Councillor Henry, Councillor Bodley. Councillor Vassick. Very good.
So it sounds like many of us. Thank you, through you, Mayor. Thank you very much for the presentation. That was very well done, very concise, and reflected the report very well. I did have a curiosity question, and when I read through the report, I had the same question. And it's regarding, if you can explain a little bit more, the greater flexibility for retail uses. I understand that, but you want to put less restrictions in, but yet I'm not sure what kinds of things you're thinking about. So if you could offer some explanation there, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. When we conducted the review of commercial policies, some designations would have a specific limit of the square footage of a food store or a pharmacy that could be permitted on those sites. And moving forward, a lot of the city's needs, we want to have more flexibility in whether those needs shift, accommodating different types of uses, that if there's an increased need of food store retail or a decreasing need to reformat the availability of the space. And there's also designations around like convenience and corridor commercial. We want to allow for different types of uses that may want to locate there but are currently unable to.
Because of size restrictions or something like that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Moving on to Councillor Henry.
Yeah, I mean, we had a corridor commercial issue that came up for a site in my ward, and it went back and forth, and folks were trying to figure out how to use committee of adjustment, but then you can't use that to change uses, and it was a big mess for people that were already there and maybe hadn't done their homework when they started the business, but then it came to a head when someone was looking for a business license. So there are some live challenges that we sort of face in transition zones on that. I had a couple of questions here for staff, but also I'll start with our consultants here. In looking, I want focus in on sort of the industrial land and the recommendation on the west side employment lands. I mean, we've gone through an exercise. The recommendation is to treat it a bit differently than the exercise we had just sort of gone through. And I see the rationale, and that makes a great deal of sense. But the one thing I noted in here was there was a comment as well around, high skills, sort of employment lands, industrial areas, and trying to attract those, and it being difficult, and thinking about sort of location and transit access and lack of access to a car. That was highlighted in the report. So the recommendation seems that this is not a good place for office because, the major transit station areas are great, but to what extent do we need to do more work on providing alternative modes of transit to the west side employment lands to make the industrial vision come true as well, right? It may be better suited, but I'm hearing that it's not as well suited as it might need to be to attract the kind of firms that we've been trying to attract to Generation Park. So can you offer some commentary on sort of how you're seeing industrial needs and what kind of amenity or service profile we need to think about as well, rather than just redesignating it?
Sure. I just want to make sure thank you, Councillor. I just want to make sure I understand the question.
Yeah.
So first part was, do we want to provide more transportation options to the West Side lands?
Yeah, is that a critical component as well to being able to attract sort of the high-end sort of industrial uses we're talking about? Is that something I read in here? Because
we did make a comment in some of our research. A lot of typically in knowledge-based work, we find that those workers are attracted to amenities and transit, but there is increasing research that those are skill supported as well in general employment and tech manufacturing type labor. I believe our recommendations, particularly with the West Side lands, is just understanding as they are now, understanding the city's current transportation framework. Given the status, we believe the West Side is better fitted for employment uses. And the really key thought underscoring that is how large the parcel is. If we're thinking about like other office uses, of course, we still want tech-based manufacturing. Those can require more flexible, different types of configurations in the office/industrial type building. I believe there's a second part to the question.
I think I layered it all in, so I think that was what I was getting at.
Okay.
I came around it a couple of different ways, and what I just take from that is that it would be helpful in our other advocacy, efforts to work on an early basis with GRT at the region and figure out what we can do better through the West Side employment lands, because a Monday to Friday, bus along the top is not going to cut it. I think to being able to sort of fully attract that. So, yeah, and there's some challenging routing issues around that part of the city as well to get people to where they need to go, as I'm sure Councillor Bodley would know from his folks up in Vista Hills. So that just entered into my mind when I read those two lines and saw the recommendation. I was wondering about work from home. Mm-hmm. You've talked about that here. You've done some research on forecasts for what's going on in sort of that space. And I wanted to sort of pull back a little bit. Do you see the role of this kind of exercise to be, what are people doing, and therefore our planning framework should enable that and support it? Or should we, if we have goals around work from home to sort of reduce the number of trips, and that's a greenhouse gas energy conversation that we've had, should that lead the planning framework around how we sort of think about supporting and encouraging and growing work from home as an option? So I'm trying to figure out where the cart and the horse are in your mind on sort of planning and sort of the on the ground work from home experience that you're seeing in your research.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor. Again, I want to deconstruct this question in two parts. The first is the work from home trend. So our findings conclude that it's still too short term to make any long-term conclusions about the long-term impacts of remote work and COVID. But the most important thing to remember is we're planning for the next 30 years to 2051. We want to make sure that we want to maintain opportunities for office, and if so, to locate them in strategic zones where people want to be. where people are most likely to take active transportation to work. That would go concurrently with the reduced vehicular trips as one of the metrics in the Transform Waterloo Region strategy. And so those are two kind of separate situations, right? The first is we want to make sure there's still space for office. We want to protect opportunities for that. People still want flexibility. There's still many studies showing that the value of the office and collaboration, those still remain. But if we're planning for them, we want them to be in good locations and not so ones that are going to maintain 20% vacancies throughout the year. Trying to remember the second portion of the question.
No, I think it was generally what's the policy orientation we should be looking at if we're trying to grow the percentage of sort of work from home, or at least enable that to grow, rather than say, hey, it's over here, so we'll just do this because that enables the whatever we see today, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. And it's really important to monitor those policy trends. As I mentioned, like we conducted this study throughout the past year, and these trends could very well change in the next 5 years. We want to maintain watch over how that trend is occurring, but maintain also the balance of having opportunities available.
Yeah. No, and I'm glad you sort of read on the metrics part, because it's when we look at 2050, the make fewer trips, particularly the commuter trips, the target was a 40% reduction for vehicle trips. Doesn't mean you can't be walking, right? I think that's part of the displacement, but it's getting along the lines of that thinking. I appreciate the response. The other piece on that is around sort of where we're locating the retail aspect. So I've done industrial, now office, so here's the retail question. We've got some direction around sort of 15-minute cities where you can meet your sort of daily needs within 15 minutes of a walk, cycle or roll, rather than drive halfway across the city to meet your daily needs. The typology that I was seeing in your report for sort of local serving retail space, I think was the term used, suggested that those are, even on a local scale to meet daily needs, are rather substantive in size, right? That you need a food store and maybe a dollar store and 3 or 4 other things I'm forgetting, but that the things that do well have a bunch of stuff going on there. So do you see from your research and trends that that's essential as we sort of plan those kinds of daily need nodes, that they have a whole bunch of stuff happen all in one space and therefore need a larger plot of land to sort of make a node? Or are those the kinds of things that you would see as being able to be distributed in smaller sort of pockets, maybe into some of the interiors of neighborhoods as we sort of change what we think of, maybe not one big node, but a few smaller nodes, so that it's accessible to more people within that 15-minute radius? I suppose I'm trying to sort of understand, does our mix of sort of nodes, major and minor nodes, work for the 15-minute cities we want to have? And if not, because they're slightly too far away for some people, how do we sort of make sure that we've created viable retail spaces that will let people sort of do that, and what's the scale we need to think of? So that's where my head's at. So I'm curious what thoughts you may have there.
Thank you, Councillor. Firstly, the question of should retail space be larger? There's a lot of different types of uses, and on the slide here, these are the major categories of retail service commercial space that we're looking at. What's really important to remember about the city of Waterloo is in terms of vacant commercial parcels, there are only about 6 hectares left. And there's really no opportunity for a large format retail plaza in the city anymore, like a Bridgeport Plaza. There's no space for that anymore. This is where our recommendations about mixed-use development and ensuring that they're not on a site-by-site basis. It's not one building needs to accommodate this many types of uses. It should be for a broader region. And we find that in high-density mixed-use developments, you're reaching these sort of population densities much quicker because there's a lot more people in a compacted space versus a traditional large format retail that supports multiple subdivisions of single detached homes. So if we're planning for mixed use 15-minute neighborhoods, it doesn't have to be necessarily one single building. We're looking at it from that broader neighborhood perspective. It definitely needs to be enough food store retail. And in the report we mentioned about one supermarket for every 10,000 residents. That's generally around the ratio that we identify in our commercial studies. And there's other services like dental offices, salons that go in with that day-to-day shopping needs to support residents.
Okay, I just needed you to help me reconcile those two pieces, so thank you for that. Getting in on sort of that design in a mixed-use space, because that was another one of my questions. Some of the things that I've seen or heard is that, the existing stock of sort of retail establishments and strip malls have a certain price point that is more broadly accessible to new small businesses, new Canadians starting that up to be able to gain entry into that space and operate. The costs are less. Mm-hmm. Whereas a new build, mixed use sort of development is, today's building costs, which is not low and are going up and are therefore sort of more expensive spaces to operate and can be sort of challenging, particularly if they've been designed by a residential developer who's just told to put in retail at grade and they don't really know how to put in retail at grade because they build residential units. As opposed to folks that build commercial units and then they find somebody to figure out how to build a house on top, like how to build units on top, right? You've talked about flexibility. Is there anything that we should be looking for when designing sort of these mixed use, regulations around retail with, other uses above that would help? Sort of the viability of sort of those small businesses from a price perspective, from a design perspective, from making sure that those things will actually work for retailers in ways that plazas are relatively easy to design so that they work for retailers, but mixed use is hard. So I'm trying to think of what we can do in our framework to make sure we're doing that well, because sometimes this is being very difficult in some spots in the city for some of the things that have been built.
Thank you, Councillor. Interesting enough, when we conducted the community survey, many of the respondents were looking for more independent food stores, different types of locally owned businesses, especially in the uptown area. And the most critical component of mixed use and high density projects is their viability of those commercial spaces relies on a large volume of people and ensuring that there's also there's high volumes of pedestrian traffic that pass through them and active transportation modes. When we see in our research, when we see mixed-use nodes located or mixed-use buildings away from concentrated population densities or are in automobile-oriented areas, those buildings tend to suffer from higher vacancies. And if you are getting a tenant, they're largely sort of like a dental office. So if we're looking at ensuring that our mixed-use projects remain financially feasible, it's creating the policies that support people wanting to walk there, wanting to make that a destination or visit those areas, whether they're evening population, whether they're people who live there, or the daytime population, people who work there. And it's really that volume of traffic that makes them financially viable.
Okay, that's helpful framing. And my last question, because I know I've been asking for a little bit, is one I'll ask Rick instead, and it's arising from your report. It was around sort of the, trying to prioritize office in proximity to sort of LRT stations, and that having them be really close was something that was identified as things we should protect. When we did our station area planning, we'd identified some areas, particularly around the R&T park, among some others, for conversion of sort of employment uses towards sort of residential uses, and then the region had to do it because it got taken out of our hands by the province. But our focus at that point was the best place to put that residential was close to those stations, and those would be the priorities for conversion. This feels like the recommendation we're seeing is the opposite of what that was. It's protect the office, and this one's actually that should be residential. And so I'm wondering staff's view as you sort of take these recommendations in and work that into the official plan review, what our perspective is as a city on sort of this. We can't prioritize both perfectly. So what's sort of our take on what we should do based on the consultant report here and what we've done before?
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Henry. Yes, so to a bit of background, through the stationary planning process, some strategic sites near the station areas were identified for priority for conversion. The rationale behind that is because with the employment designation, it's quite restrictive in what's permitted. So it's only allowed office and some other employment uses. And it didn't allow a wider range of mixed use, a bit more commercial and residential in those areas. Through that study, it was determined that to ensure success for these station areas, having the widest range of mixed use and that kind of flexibility in the areas in closest proximity to the stops was really important. So that's why those sites were identified as priority conversion areas. It wasn't necessarily to take away the employment uses, it's really to add on additional uses for mixed use type development. So if we fast forward to this study, on the surface, I can see where there looks like there's a bit of conflict, but really it actually reinforces the direction that we took at that time. The key is to prioritize, if we're going to have offices, it should be in these areas in the closest proximity within 400 meters of the station area. In addition to that, because of the station area perspective and for that framework, we also want to allow different uses, so a bit more commercial and residential, to have that 24-hour viability for these areas. So we still want to maintain employment uses, but really the intent for our conversion wasn't necessarily to take one use away and put another one in, is to add additional layers of uses on the areas. So it is compatible with direction from this study.
Yeah, and that's what I was wondering, whether it was an effort to say, okay, you got built here, you've got, you can do the conversion piece, but that means we're going to have like a half floor retail, a couple of floors of office, and then you can build some residential spaces above, and then you've got sort of 24/7 sort of viability in the site. It's not, and that in order to build your residential, you got to do some employment in this area. We're not taking it away. That's sort of the view that we're looking at. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Over to Councillor Bodley.
Thank you, through your Mayor Jaworski. I consistently hear from folks in Vista Hills that it's a 40-minute walk to a bus stop on the weekend, so thanks for highlighting that, Jeff, and Councillor Henry. And yeah, I think we should highlight that from a transit perspective in that area of the city, the boardwalk is a transit hub, and it's relatively close by. So how we advocate for better transit service, not just into the Vista Hills subdivision, but through Generation Park, I think is going to be really important as the subdivision and Gen Park both build out. Councillor Henry stole all my thunder and said it more eloquently than I will, but I'm going to try and add on to this on the 15-minute neighborhood piece because it's really interesting. So I guess maybe I'll start with just a simple question. Like, it's highlighted in the report here that the ROP's new direction is towards 15-minute neighborhoods. Could we confirm that that's something that we're looking at integrating into the city's official plan as we look forward?
Through Mayor Jaworski to Councillor Bodley. Yes, so we have multiple layers of direction for 15-minute communities. First and foremost, it came through the Transportation Master Plan as the most recent city-led initiative that directs looking at 15-minute communities more in depth through the OP review. And then that was reinforced through the recent ROP that was approved, also directing local municipalities to implement policies for 15-minute communities. So it's definitely on our radar. We're actively reviewing those policies, and that will be part of the next draft coming forward to council.
Awesome. So as a follow-up then, through you, Mayor Jaworski, I think we can all sort of envision what a 15-minute neighborhood looks like in the core. I think that's pretty easy to see. But when we look at some of our established neighborhoods or a neighborhood that is essentially like an enclave like Vista Hills is, it's really difficult for me to envision a 15-minute neighborhood out there, and especially for us to go back now and sort of retrofit that, given that the entire neighborhood is virtually completed. And I know that there were a few sort of designated areas within that subdivision where we permitted certain commercial uses but didn't mandate it, and those are now houses. And so I'm curious if you could just sort of share how we look at the 15-minute neighborhood piece vis-a-vis commercial, convenience commercial type uses, and what particularly as we look at sort of established neighborhoods and areas where, the likelihood of stuff getting torn down and rebuilt is a little bit lower. What's sort of the long-term vision or plan for how we not just codify this into our policies, but actually make it viable and happen.
Through Mayor Jaworski to the councillor, yes, for retrofits, it will be more of a challenge. When you're talking about greenfield areas, it's a blank slate, and you can say these areas are reserved for commercial uses. So it's definitely simpler in that regard to mandate what goes where. But it'll be a longer term transition in these older neighborhoods to incorporate that. So first and foremost, what we found out from the study is that we need to protect and maintain the commercial that we have. So if there's redevelopments, we will likely look at policies in the official plan that maintains the existing commercial function in those neighborhoods so we don't lose already what we have, because we already have a shortage. On top of that, we will look at opportunities for smaller scale redevelopment to incorporate commercial uses in addition to what's there. So the older areas are also areas that tend to be more candidates for redevelopment. And so as those redevelopments come, that'll be the opportunity to make sure that, if you're going to have a certain residential component, that we also mandate that there's a commercial component going forward. And not just commercial, but other softer services that we're seeing as intensification goes forward, the daycares and schools. So all this is bigger package that we look at through the OP review. But we'll definitely be looking at how to maintain and enhance those older areas going forward.
Thank you. And just a final follow-up, if I can, through you, Mayor Jaworski. So is there any consideration along sort of these lines of thinking about sort of where we're headed, of some of the as yet undeveloped portions of these developments that have already been pre-zoned and perhaps imagined for residential, and perhaps even well down the line, I'm not sure, in the site plan side of things, to, if not consider rezoning some of those spaces, engaging with the development community in these spaces to look at whether or not there's interest there, and whether or not we would, nudge them towards that in some of these as yet undeveloped areas of these subdivisions, to sort of guide us towards where we're headed long term as a community.
The Mayor to the councillor, so the process would be through the OP review. That would definitely signal potential shift in direction that would come through that, and that would allow the have those conversations going forward, and then down the road there's an opportunity to revisit some of our zoning. So if we have the policies and the principles in place in the OP, then that does allow us to shift the conversation down the road. That the key is to have that framework in the OP first of all.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rick.
Thank you. Over to Councillor Vasek, then Bonagor, then Freeman.
Thanks to Mayor Jaworski. Mariana, you're doing a great job, by the way. I don't know if this is have you done lots of these before?
Full disclosure, I'm a one-year consultant and I'm stepping in some big shoes.
Well, you're doing great. Well
you.
Done. Okay, so it actually is linked to Councillor Bodley's question, and when you say, I don't know who this is for, if this is going to be for you or if this is going to be for Rick, but you can probably both chime in. Like, you're talking about a shift in direction. So council has not approved a new OP, and this council won't, but here you're presenting to us sort of the shift you're hoping that council might move towards, or what's going to come before the next council. So I get very excited about this, about visioning and strategic documents, very exciting, but I am also extremely impatient, and I'm excited. So how do we do this now? And also it's going to require a whole bunch of steps. It's going to require the OP review. It's going to require other policy reviews, bylaw and things like that. So what I'm curious about is, we know that we need to expedite a whole bunch of things, particularly for the climate emergency, like 15-minute communities and other things. So what I'm wondering about is, how can we take interim steps to achieve this shift in direction, this proposed shift in direction that hasn't happened yet? Can we be nimble in our city's day-to-day operations, or do the policies need to be here?
To Mayor Jaworski, to Councillor Vasek. So the process for the OP review is, this study will help, if it's approved, will help provide direction. So the next step after we have the study is it lays out a pretty good map for what areas we need to prioritize to update from a policy perspective in our OP. And we're looking to update a draft of the OP for the community to review in the first half of 2023. So we're definitely well into the OP review process. So it'll come, from planning policy perspective fairly quickly. We know this information here now, so we know kind of what our gaps are and what we have to protect. So while we don't have it in policy, we certainly can lean on this information as any other technical document for the city to know that, if when things come forward, we'll definitely look to have more commercial components, protect certain employment uses, for example, because we know that these are gaps and these are areas we need to focus in on. But as far as a detailed policy perspective, we're looking for first half of 2023. We'll have a much closer step to having this in place as policy going forward, should council approve it.
Okay, thank you. That sounds great.
Thank you. Over to Councillor Bonagor.
Thank you, through you, Mayor Jaworski. My fellow councillors have asked some of the questions I had down. The last one standing is pretty simple, and I'm hoping just to help break some of this down for some of the residents who might be watching this or tuning in later. So I'm the Uptown councillor, and the thing I hear about most is the need for smaller, flexible spaces, because that enables a lower startup cost for local entrepreneurs. And also there's a need for spaces that can accommodate kind of health and family services like GPs, specialists, childcare, not just retail and commercial. So for the people who are kind of listening to the report, is that the kind of thing that's envisioned through what you've brought here today and through what's proposed?
Thank you, Mayor Jaworski. Thank you, Councillor. Excellent question. And that's a pretty critical component of our recommendations about mixed use. It's that people are looking for different types of uses at grade. We're not just thinking about retail anymore. We're thinking about, as you mentioned, that there could be healthcare uses, there could be community services. A daycare would be a great thing to have in a high density population. We want to encourage families to think about living in a higher density area, but also have access to those type of services that they would need. Essentially, about smaller units, that is something that we've also heard, that sometimes retail units or commercial units are too large. They're harder to occupy. It's harder to find a tenant suitable for that. And that's critical to how mixed use should be developed moving forward. They should be more flexible. There should be opportunities to re-demise those units and fit them with, for example, the type of exhaust you need it for, say, a food store, but in the future that could change into a different type of use. You want to build them with the flexibility, knowing that market needs change, the community needs also change, and sometimes they may not be retail service. They may be a totally different use.
That's it from me. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Over to Councillor Freeman. I'll just check to see if anybody else has a hand going up.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski. So one of the questions that I was thinking about when I read this, and it's probably a question for staff, honestly, is the relationship between this commercial supply and demand analysis and how it is that we're going to think about minor nodes and major nodes and primary nodes in our OP going forward. Right now, I think we're allowing a lot of higher density residential with less focus on connectivity of nodes. And so you might not have an answer today, but it's certainly one piece that comes to mind as we start thinking about this.
The Mayor Jaworski to the councillor. Yes. The fact is, in Waterloo, we're fairly built out. So the nodes that we have are mostly there. There's only 2 nodes, one in the northeast and one in the northwest, that are identified but not built. So those will be the last traditional large sites. Everything else that we have, we'll need to, again, maintain that commercial use. So likely those nodes, they'll stay nodes. That commercial use will stay, and there will likely redevelop over time. The key will be to ensure that those commercial uses are maintained, and in those larger nodes, actually additional commercial uses will be required there as well. So it doesn't change our framework from a land use perspective as far as nodes and corridors. If anything, the requirement to integrate those and have a good connectivity will increase. But it's just ensuring that we have all the proper uses in those existing nodes going forward, because those will be the focus areas, and we won't want to lose those uses in the future.
So when we look at 5-minute neighborhoods, one of the pieces that I'm wondering is whether or not we're going to reconsider some of our zoning bylaws associated with ground floor convertible space. Because certainly right now, a lot of land developers are willing to create a convertible space with the anticipation of only moving it to commercial if needed. But this report's telling me that we need to actually make sure those spaces happen.
Mayor Jaworski to Councillor Freeman. Yeah, we have policies in our OP currently, like in Northdale, for example, for that flexible space. Certainly it's something that we'll look into more detail, that if we need more of those types of policies to allow that flexibility and that transition over time to, as Marion mentioned, that needs change, and it would be good to have those spaces that are available to accommodate needs as we grow. So it's definitely something that we'll have to look more in depth to doing.
And I guess my last question is if this analysis is actually pointing to some commercial uses that maybe we don't have enough of, and I've heard childcare mentioned a lot here, as somebody who designed and built a daycare center, I can tell you that commercial space is not affordable as a space in which to deliver childcare services. And so I'm just thinking that there might be some recommendations that come out of this report that are better suited to thinking about changes in our zoning bylaws associated with prestige employment lands, because employment uses square footage cost is better aligned with a childcare budget, and right now a childcare has to go through a process to be able to implement services within employment zones, in particular office uses or prestige employment. And I think we should rethink that. And there may be some other uses that come up through this study that are better suited to thinking about some of the other employment use zoning that we have in place. And then I guess kind of one of the last things in one of the slides you illustrated, you had shown a commercial node in and around the prestige employment that we have on the west side. And, I think we just need to be thoughtful about the fact that if you did put in a use, such as a daycare, into that commercial use, it does change the compatibility between that use and employment use if we aren't thinking of making a change to the zoning on the employment use side. So there's a few connective pieces there that I just wanted to raise that maybe outcomes from this study that aren't directly related to land zoned commercial.
Through Mayor Jaworski to Councillor Freeman, certainly there's definitely a lot of implementation pieces that we'll have to look forward. So when we do bring forward the recommended policies, you're absolutely correct. There will be a lot of those interrelated policies and the downstream result through zoning that will require careful consideration. So I don't have a direct a direction for you today, but certainly these are bigger questions that staff will be asking at when we look to going from the strategic directions to the actual implementation policies down the road. Something for us to consider.
Thank you. I don't see any further questions. So with that, I'll look around the council horseshoe table to see if anybody wishes to move this. Councillor Vasic does. Councillor Bodley does. I'll call the vote. All those in favor? Passed unanimously. And thank you very much for your report to us. Pass along Councillor Vasic's good words. Maybe put something on LinkedIn for her or something like that. All good. Moving along. We have one item left this afternoon. That's the proposed 2023 council schedule. Ready to move it? Moved by Councillor Freeman, second by Councillor Hanmer. All those in favor? That's all of us. That carries. With that, we are in recess until tonight at 6:30.